Study Section 11 International Trade Institutions. Introduction. Internationally coordinated tariff reduction as a trade policy dates back to the 1930s. In 1930, the United States passed a remarkably irresponsible tariff law, the Smoot-Hawley Act. Under this act, tariff rates rose steeply and U.S. trade fell sharply. Some economists argue that the Smoot-Hawley Act helped deepen the Great Depression. Within a few years after the Act passage, the U.S. administration concluded that tariffs needed to be reduced, but this posed serious problems of political coalition building. Any tariff reduction would be opposed by those members of Congress whose districts contained firms producing competing goods, while the benefit would be so widely diffused that few in Congress could be mobilized on the other side. To reduce tariff rates, tariff reduction needed to be linked to some concrete benefit for exporters. The initial solution to this political problem was bilateral tariff negotiations. The United States would approach some country that was a major exporter of some good, say a sugar exporter, and offer to lower tariffs on sugar if that country would lower its tariffs on some U.S. exports. The attractiveness of the deal to U.S. exporters would help counter the political weight of the sugar interest. In the foreign country, the attractiveness of the deal to foreign sugar exporters would balance the political influence of import competing interests. Such bilateral negotiations helped reduce the average duty on U.S. import from 59% in 1932 to 25% shortly after World War II. Bilateral negotiations, however, do not take full advantage of international coordination. For one thing, benefit from a bilateral negotiation may spill over to countries that have not made any concessions. For example, if the United States reduces tariffs on coffee as a result of a deal with Brazil, Colombia will also gain from a higher world coffee price. Furthermore, some advantageous deals may inherently involve more than two countries. The United States sells more to Europe, Europe sells more to Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia sells more to Japan, and Japan sells more to the United States. Thus, the next step, international trade liberalization, was to proceed to multilateral negotiations involving a number of countries. Multilateral negotiations began soon after the end of World War II. Originally, diplomats from the victorious allies imagined that such negotiations would take place under the auspices of a proposed body called the International Trade Organization, paralleling the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In 1947, unwilling to wait until the ITO was in place, a group of 23 countries began trade negotiations under a provisional set of rules that became known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. As it turned out, the ITO was never established because it ran into severe political opposition, especially in the United States. So the provisional agreement ended up governing world trade for the next 48 hours. Officially, the GATT was an agreement, not an organization. The countries participating in the agreement were officially designated as contracting parties, not members. In practice, the GATT did maintain a permanent secretariat in Geneva, which everyone referred to as the GATT. In 1995, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, was established, finally creating the former organization envisaged 50 years earlier. However, the GATT rules remain in force, and the basic logic of the system remains the same. One way to think about the GATT-WTO approach to trade is to use a mechanical analogy. It's like a device designed to push a heavy object. The world economy gradually up a slope. The path to free trade To get there requires both levers to push the object in the right direction, as well as ratchet to prevent backsliding. The principal ratchet in the system is the process of binding. When a tariff rate is bound, the country imposing the tariff agrees not to raise the rate in the future. At present, almost all tariff rates in developed countries are bound, as are about three-quarters of the rates in developing countries. There is some wiggle room in bound tariffs. A country can raise a tariff if it gets the agreement of other countries, which usually means providing compensation by reducing other tariffs. In practice, binding has been highly effective, with very little backsliding in tariffs over the past half-century. In addition to binding tariffs, the GATT-WTO system generally tries to prevent non-tariff interventions in trade. Export subsidies are not allowed, with one big exception. Back at the GATT inception, the United States insisted on a loophole for agricultural export, which has since been exploited on a large scale by the European Union. As we pointed out earlier in this chapter, most of the actual cost of protection in the United States comes from import quotas. The GATT-WTO system in effect grandfathers existing import quotas, though there has been an ongoing and often successful effort to remove such quotas or convert them to tariffs. New import quotas are generally forbidden except as temporary measures to deal with market disruption, an undefined phrase usually interpreted to mean surges of imports that threaten to put a domestic sector suddenly out of business. The lever used to make forward progress is the somewhat stylized process known as a trade round, in which a large group of countries get together to negotiate a set of tariff reductions and other measures to liberalize trade. 8 trade rounds have occurred since 1947, the last of which, the Uruguay round, completed in 1994, established the WTO. In 1999, an attempt to start a new round in Seattle failed. 2 years later, a meeting at the Persian Gulf city of Doha formally began a 9th round. The first 5 trade rounds under the GATT took the form of parallel bilateral negotiations, where each country negotiates pairwise with a number of countries at once. For example, if Germany were to offer a tariff reduction that would benefit both France and Italy, it could ask both of them for reciprocal concessions. The ability to make more extensive deals together with the worldwide economic recovery from the war helped to permit substantial tariff reductions. The 6th multilateral trade agreement, known as the Kennedy Round, was completed in 1967. This agreement involved an across-the-board 50% reduction in tariffs by the major industrial countries, except for specified industries whose tariffs were left unchanged. The negotiations were over which industries to exempt rather than over the size of the cut for industries not given special treatment. Overall, the Kennedy Round reduced average tariffs by about 35%. The so-called Tokyo Round of trade negotiations completed in 1979 reduced tariffs by a formula more complex than that of the Kennedy Round. In addition, new codes were established in an effort to control the proliferation of non-tariff barriers, such as voluntary export restraints and orderly marketing agreements. Finally, in 1994, an 8th round of negotiations, the so-called Uruguay Round, was completed. The provisions of that round were approved by the US Congress after acrimonious debate. We describe the result of these negotiations. The Uruguay Round. Major international trade negotiations invariably open with a ceremony, take 2, with a ceremony in one exotic locale and conclude with a ceremonial signing in another. The 8th round of global trade negotiations carried out under the GATT began in 1986 with a meeting at the coastal resort of Punta del Este, Uruguay, hence the name Uruguay Round. The participants then repaired to Geneva, where they engaged in 7 years of offers and counter-offers, threat and counter-threat, and above all, tens of thousands of hours of meetings so boring that even the most experienced diplomat had difficulty staying awake. The round was scheduled for completion by 1990 but ran into serious political difficulties. In late 1993, the negotiators finally produced a basic document consisting of 400 pages of agreement, together with supplementary documents detailing the specific commitment of member nations with regard to particular markets and products, about 22,000 pages in all. The agreement was signed in Marrakech, Morocco, in April 1994 and ratified by the major nations after bitter political controversy in some cases, including the United States, by the end of that year. As the length of the document suggests, the end result of the Uruguay round are not that easy to summarize. The most important result may, however, be grouped under the headings trade liberalization and administrative reforms. Trade liberalization. The Uruguay round, like previous GATT negotiations, cut tariff rates around the world. The numbers can sound impressive. The average tariff imposed by advanced countries will fall almost 40% as a result of the round. However, tariff rates were already quite low. In fact, the average tariff rate will fall only from 6.3 to 3.9%, enough to produce only a small increase in world trade. More important than this overall tariff reduction are the moves to liberalize trade in two important sectors, agriculture and clothing. World trade in agricultural products has been highly distorted. Japan is notorious for import restrictions that lead to internal prices of rice, beef, and other foods several times as high as world market prices. Europe's massive export subsidies under the Common Agricultural Program were described. At the beginning of the Uruguay round, the United States had an ambitious goal: free trade in agricultural products by the year 2000. The actual achievement was far more modest but still significant. The agreement required agricultural exporters to reduce the value of subsidies by 36% and the volume of subsidized exports by 21% over a 6-year period. Countries that protect their farmers with import quotas like Japan were required to replace quotas with tariffs which may not be increased in the future. World trade in textiles and clothing has also been highly distorted by the multi-fiber arrangement. The Uruguay round will phase out the MFA over a 10-year period, eliminating all quantitative restrictions on trade in textiles and clothing. This is a fairly dramatic liberalization. Remember that most estimates suggest that protection of clothing imposes a larger cost on US consumers than all other protectionist measures combined. It is worth noting, however, that the formula to be used in phasing out the MFA is heavily backloaded. Much of the liberalization will be postponed until late in the transition period, that is, around 2003 or 2004. Some trade experts are worried about the credibility of such long-range commitment, wondering whether a treaty signed in 1994 can really force politicians to take a politically difficult action 10 years later. A final important trade action under the Uruguay round is a new set of rules concerning government procurement purchases made not by private firms or consumers but by government agencies. Such procurement has long provided protected market for many kinds of goods, from construction equipment to vehicles. The Uruguay round set new rules that should open up a wide range of government contracts to imported products. From the GATT to the WTO, much of the publicity surrounding the Uruguay round and much of the controversy swirling around the world trading system since then has focused on the RAND's creation of a new institution, the World Trade Organization. In 1995, this organization replaced the ad hoc secretariat that administered the GATT. The WTO has become the organization that Take two, the WTO has become the organization that opponents of globalization love to hate. It has been accused by both the left and the right of acting as a sort of world government, undermining national sovereignty. An updated version of the original GATT text has been incorporated into the WTO rules. The GATT, however, applied only to trade in goods, world trade in services, that is, intangible things like insurance, consulting, and banking, was not subject to any agreed upon set of rules. As a result, many countries applied regulations that openly or de facto discriminated against foreign suppliers. The GATT's neglect of trade in services became an increasingly glaring omission. Because modern economies have increasingly focused on the production of services rather than physical goods, so the WTO agreement included rules on trade in services, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, or GATS. In practice, these rules have not yet had much impact on trade in services. Their main purpose is to serve as a basis for negotiating future trade rounds. In addition to a broad shift from producing goods to producing services, advanced countries have also experienced a shift from depending on physical capital to depending on intellectual property. Protected by patents and copyright, 30 years ago, General Motors was the quintessential modern corporation. Now it's Microsoft. Thus defining the international application of international property rights has also become a major preoccupation. The WTO tries to take on this issue with its agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property, TRIPS. The application of TRIPS in the pharmaceutical industry has become a subject of heated debate. The most important new aspect of the WTO, however, is generally acknowledged to be its dispute settlement procedure. The basic problem arises when one country accuses another of violating the rules of the trading system. The most important new aspect of the WTO, however, is generally acknowledged to be its dispute settlement procedure. The basic problem arises when one country accuses another of violating the rules of the trading system. Before the WTO, there were international tribunals in which Canada could press its case, but such proceedings tended to drag on for years, even decades, and even when a ruling had been issued, there was no way to enforce it. This did not mean that the GATS rules had no force. Neither the United States nor other countries wanted to acquire a reputation as cut flaws, so they made considerable effort to keep their actions GATT legal, but gray area cases tended to go unresolved. The WTO contains a much more formal and effective procedure. Panels of experts are selected to hear cases, normally reaching a final conclusion in less than a year. Even with appeals, the procedure is not supposed to take more than 15 months. Suppose that the WTO concludes that a nation has, in fact, been violating the rules and the country nonetheless refuses to change its policy. Then what? The WTO itself has no enforcement powers. What it can do is grant the country that filed the complaint the right to retaliate. To use our Canada-US example, the government of Canada might be given the right to impose restrictions on US export without itself being considered in violation of WTO rules. In the case of the banana dispute, a WTO ruling found the European Union in violations when Europe remained recalcitrant. The United States temporarily imposed tariffs on such items as designer handbags. The hope and expectation is that few disputes will get this far. In many cases, the threat to bring a dispute before the WTO should lead to a settlement. In the great majority of other cases, countries accept the WTO ruling and change their policies. Benefits and costs. The economic impact of the Uruguay round is difficult to estimate. If nothing else, think about the logistics. To do an estimate, one must translate an immense document from one impenetrable jargon, legalese, into another, economics, assign numbers to the translation, then feed the whole thing into a computer model of the world economy. The matter is made worse by the fact that, as described above, much of the important action is backloaded so that we will not really see some of the important provisions of the round work in practice until nearly a decade after its signing. The most widely cited estimates are those of the GATT itself and of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, another international organization, this one consisting only of rich countries and based in Paris. Both estimates suggest a gain to the world economy as a whole of more than $200 billion annually once the agreement is fully enforced. This will raise world real income by about 1%. As always, there are dissenting estimates on both sides. Some economists claim that the estimated gains are exaggerated, particularly because they assume that export and import will respond strongly to the new liberalizing moves. A probably larger minority of critics argues that these estimates are considerably too low for the dynamic reasons discussed earlier in this chapter. In any case, it is clear that the usual logic of trade liberalization will apply. The cost of the Uruguay round will be felt by concentrated, often well-organized groups, while much of the benefit will accrue to broad, diffuse populations. The progress on agriculture will directly hurt the small but influential populations of farmers in Europe, Japan, and other countries where agricultural prices are far above world levels. These losses should be much more than offset by gains to consumers and taxpayers in those countries, but because this benefit will be very widely spread, they may be little noticed. Similarly, the liberalization of trade in textiles and clothing will produce some concentrated pain for workers and companies, take two, and companies in those industries, offset by considerably larger but far less visible consumer gains. Given the strong distributional impact of the Uruguay round, it is actually remarkable that an agreement was reached at all. Indeed, after the failure to achieve anything close to agreement by the 1990 target, many commentators began to pronounce the whole trade negotiation process to be dead. That in the end, agreement was achieved, if on a more modest scale than originally hoped, may be attributed to an interlocking set of political calculations. In the United States, the gains to agricultural exporters and the prospective gains to service exporters if the GATT opens the door to substantial liberalization helped offset the complaints of the clothing industry. Many developing countries supported the round because of the new opportunities it would offer to their own textile and clothing export. Also, some of the concessions negotiated under the agreement were an excuse to make policy changes that would eventually have happened anyway. For example, the sheer expense of Europe's Common Agricultural Program in a time of budget deficit made it ripe for cutting in any case. An important factor in the final success of the round, however, was fear of what would happen if it failed. By 1993, protectionist currents were evidently running strong in the United States and elsewhere. Trade negotiations in countries that might otherwise have refused to go along with the agreement, such as France, Japan, or South Korea, in all of which powerful farm lobbies angrily opposed trade liberalization, therefore feared that failure to agree would be dangerous. That is, they fear that a failed round would not mean mere lack of progress but substantial backsliding on the progress made toward free trade over the previous 4 decades. Preferential trading agreement. The international trade agreements that we have described so far all involved a non-discriminatory reduction in tariff rate. For example, when the United States agrees with Germany to lower its tariff on imported machinery, the new tariff rate applies to machinery from any nation rather than just import from Germany. Such non-discrimination is normal in most tariffs. Indeed, the United States grants many countries a status known formally as that of Most Favored Nation (MFN), a guarantee that their exporters will pay tariffs no higher than that of the nation that pays the lowest. All countries granted MFN status pay the same rate. Tariff reductions under GATT, always with one important exception, are made on an MFN basis. There are some important cases, however, in which nations establish preferential trading agreements under which the tariffs they apply to each other's products are lower than the rates on the same goods coming from other countries. The GATT in general prohibits such agreements but makes a rather strange exception. It is against the rules for country A to have lower tariffs on import from country B than on those from country C, but it is acceptable if countries B and C agree to have zero tariff on each other's products. That is, the GATT forbids preferential trading agreements in general as a violation of the MFN principle but allows them if they lead to free trade between the agreeing countries. In general, two or more countries agreeing to establish free trade can do so in one or two ways. They can establish a free trade area in which each country's goods can be shipped to the other without tariffs, but in which the countries set tariffs against the outside world independently. Or they can establish a customs union in which the countries must agree on tariff rates. The North American Free Trade Agreement, which establishes free trade among Canada, the United States, and Mexico, creates a free trade area. There is no requirement in the agreement that, for example, Canada and Mexico have the same tariff rate on textiles from China. The European Union, on the other hand, is a full customs union. All of the countries must agree to charge the same tariff rate on each imported good. Each system has both advantages and disadvantages. Subject to the qualifications mentioned earlier in this chapter, tariff reduction is a good thing that raises economic efficiency. At first, it might seem that preferential tariff reductions are also good, if not as good as reducing tariffs all around. After all, isn't half a loaf better than none? Perhaps, surprisingly, this conclusion is too optimistic. It is possible for a country to make itself worse off by joining a customs union. The reason may be illustrated by a hypothetical example using Britain, France, and the United States. The United States is a low-cost producer of wheat, $4 per bushel. France, a medium-cost producer, $6 per bushel, and Britain, a high-cost producer, $8 per bushel. Both Britain and France maintain tariffs against all wheat imports. If Britain forms a customs union with France, the tariff against French but not US wheat will be abolished. Is this good or bad for Britain? To answer this, consider two cases. First, suppose that Britain's initial tariff was high enough to include wheat imports from either France or the United States. For example, with a tariff of $5 per bushel, it would cost $9 to import US wheat and $11 to import French wheat. So British consumers would buy $8 British wheat instead. When the tariff of French wheat is eliminated, imports from France will replace British production. From Britain's point of view, this is a gain. because it cost $8 to produce a bushel of wheat domestically, while Britain needs to produce only $6 worth of export goods to pay for a bushel of French wheat. On the other hand, suppose the tariff was lower, for example, $3 per bushel, so that before joining the customs union Britain bought its wheat from the United States at a cost to consumers of $7 per bushel, rather than producing its own wheat. When the customs union is formed, consumers will buy French wheat at $6 rather than US wheat at $7. So import of wheat from the United States will cease. However, US wheat is really cheaper than French wheat. The $3 tax that British consumers must pay on US wheat returns to Britain in the form of government revenue and is therefore not a net cost to the British economy. Britain will have to devote more resources to export to pay for its wheat import and will be worse off rather than better off. This possibility of a loss is another example of the theory of the second best. Think of Britain as initially having two policies that distort incentives: a tariff against US wheat and a tariff against French wheat. Although the tariff against French wheat may seem to distort incentives, it may help to offset the distortion of incentives resulting from the tariff against the United States by encouraging consumption of the cheaper US wheat. Thus, removing the tariff on French wheat can actually reduce welfare. Returning to our two cases, notice that Britain gains if the formation of a customs union leads to new trade French wheat replacing domestic production, while it loses if the trade within the customs union simply replaces trade with countries outside the union. In the analysis of preferential trading arrangements, the first case is referred to as trade creation, while the second is trade diversion. Whether a customs union is desirable or undesirable depends on whether it largely leads to trade creation or trade diversion. This is the end of Echo 451. Thanks for listening.